So you might have heard these before. Leave 6 dBs of headroom. Mix in mono, never use presets, reference tracks are mandatory. We are ranking all of it, and trust me, you're never gonna believe which ones end up in the S tier. All right, kicking things off at the bottom in the D tier, and I don't think this one is going to surprise you, you need expensive plugins or gear. That's the advice. Here's the truth, there's so many professional records being released every day that use stock plugins. And if you can't come close with the most basic form of EQ, compression, saturation, reverb, delay, name them all, no plugin or thing you buy is going to be the solution. It's just going to be a more expensive way to make the same mistake. The real gaps are bigger, and I've seen this with so many of my students. It's things like writing, arrangement, sound selection, balance. It's rarely a plugin issue. Okay, C tier. These tips are not totally wrong. It's more so the way producers apply them that's problematic. Leave 6 decibels of headroom. Oh, no, wait. Maybe you heard 8. It's definitely 8 dBs of headroom. That's the magic number. Here's the real point behind it. It's not bad advice. It's teaching you to leave headroom so that everything is not pushing into 0 or beyond. It gives you some wiggle room if you need to increase level down the line. Now the 6 dB part is kind of made up because with modern DAWs and 32-bit float, we aren't really internally clipping in the DAW. The issue can arise though if you have a plugin that isn't 32-bit float, and yes, maybe you can clip in there. Some of the analog modeled ones are built that way, but yeah, I mean 6, 8, 10, whatever you have is this number. It's not some special thing. The concept here is give yourself some headroom, give yourself some wiggle room. There's nothing more to it other than that. You know what really grinds my gears? These like EQ and compression cheat sheets that tell you like attack and release times and how to EQ a snare and a kick. So it's 2026 as I sit here and film this, and I find that these charts are a little outdated. Here's why. Most of us, 99%, are probably using samples and splice today, right? These sounds you get are already created and processed to sound great. The way these charts, though, are sort of explained, they're for beginners who don't know better, and it seems like this solution to your problems. Like, here's this, anytime you have a snare, put this on, put these compressor settings on. Anytime you have a kick, EQ it like this, and it's showing you to boost the low end and scoop the mids, but it's like, what happens if your kick doesn't need that? What happens if your snare doesn't need that? And when you're a beginner, you don't know if it needs it or not. And I think the greater message should be start with sounds that are amazing so you don't have to do that shit. Yes, I think there's purpose to these, especially like, vocals. If you were EQing raw recorded vocals, those charts can definitely help, but I think there needs to be further explanation. And I think a lot of social media just uses it as like engagement bait, right? Like people who don't know better, like it, save it. Just go find better sounds and stop trying to polish a turd. Mastering is where loudness occurs. I feel like I need to put this in the C tier only because this one steers a lot of people off course. Most of your loudness is going to come from mix balance, transient control, arrangement decisions. Like think about if your low end isn't balanced and you run that up into the master's limiter, it is going to eat up kick and bass and everything else is going to sound and feel much smaller. So think of mastering as like the last 5 to 10%. It's very small tonal shaping, transient control, limiting and bringing your song up to a commercial loudness level. But if your master needs like 8 to 10 decibels of reduction on that limiter just to hit your loudness targets, you don't have a mastering problem. You have a production and mix balance problem. This one is C tier as well. The idea is fine, but usually the execution isn't. Saturation is another one of these tools and terms I think we throw around on the internet that seems like a magic tool. It can make anything that sounds bad better, louder. So saturation is beneficial when you want to add harmonics onto something. And this can work well when you have something like a bass that you need harmonics on and you want to translate on smaller speakers. We can use saturation on a group level to glue everything together. There are definitely use cases, but putting it on everything for the sake of it to make things louder, more colorful, warmer, it's unnecessary. Like the advice I would give you is think about the signal you're starting with. If you already have a very rich sound, why would you also need to add saturation to that? Try and just be a little bit more intentional when using it, and I think you'll find that happy balance of where it actually benefits you versus where it can start to harm the mix. Should you only use one reverb? Should you put as many reverbs as you need? The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Only using one reverb in a mix can work, but it's limited. Not every sound is going to need the exact same space. Then on the flip side, having just a unique reverb on every sound, thinking of each sound individually and making it cool, usually won't work when you take all of those sounds and put them together in a mix. There's a lack of continuity there. So the best alternative, I guess you could say, would probably be somewhere in between. Have a couple of reverbs set up. And this could be a few different reverb types, like a hall, a plate, a chamber, something like that, or a room. Also have different size and decays. You could have smaller room sizes. You could also have short and longer decays, but give yourself variation between maybe 2 or 3 reverbs, and it's probably the most practical way to use it. B tier. These are generally useful tips, but they're not laws you have to abide by 24/7. So this first one, never use presets. I think there's an important message in here, but let's just first address the people who normally give this advice. And they're just like angry people on the internet. In a way, they are right, where presets aren't made to work for your song. Like if you just load a preset, it's made for 1 million people to use. What are the odds it is going to work for your track? Now, if you're able to make those presets work for your track, here's the good news. Your audience could give a shit if you made that patch or if you didn't. And I'd also say this, oh, so you can't use presets. Fine. But you could use the synth? Well, you didn't build that. Why is that okay to use, but the patch on it you can't use because that's a preset? You see what I'm saying? It's kind of ridiculous. So use presets, but more importantly, I think the message is learn your synth, because you're gonna have to manipulate those presets and make them fit your track. Always high pass everything, definitely B tier. There's good advice here. Like you think about the sounds in your mix that just don't need low end. This could be some pads, some drum elements, things that are sitting higher up. But where I think this message gets a little bit skewed is when people start like religiously low cutting everything. And a lot of times early on in your production journey, your mixes sound thin, they sound small, they sound cheap. And it's often because you're cutting the low end out of so many elements, and you're also just cutting low end based on numbers. Like leads get cut at 100, leads get cut at 200, bass gets cut here. Those numbers don't exist. Everything should be cut based on the instrumentation in that mix. You are literally stacking pieces one on top of the other. The advice is helpful. You will create headroom for your low end later on in the mix and master, but at the same time, don't overdo it. It can be overkill, and it could be the main reason why your mixes sound thin. Don't mix into a limiter or even a compressor, like a rough chain on your master. There's good advice here, and it's because those tools first can hide clipping and distortion, but those tools will also influence what you hear. So if you're squashing them unintentionally, you just don't realize, you're gonna hear things in the mix. Now you might try and solve that using EQ and all these other tools within your mix, but the reality is you were just pushing things too loud and you were unaware that the effect you were hearing was that limiter or was that compressor. So it could sometimes hide where the problems are popping up. Now on the flip side, I also think with modern music, and most of our audience here is making electronic music, that sound of compression and limiting is baked into everything we know and everything we hear. So to a certain degree, hearing that early can help you when you get to the end. You know how your sounds are interacting with a compressor and that threshold, or a limiter and its threshold. There's some good advice here, but if you're going to work into those, I think you have to be very mindful of how your levels are constantly hitting it. And you really want to be hitting the compressor and the limiter on the master the same way you would be hitting it in the end when you really mix and master your song. If it sounds good, it's good enough. Or maybe you've heard the trust your ears. This is B tier. I love the spirit behind this one because it makes it about the music and not technical purity. But at the same time, there's a big caveat. The person who's hearing this advice, your ears only know what they know. So what sounds good to you may not be the best move in that moment. This shouldn't be a reason to skip learning translation checks, mix references. Because if you do, you're gonna make decisions based on what your ears hear at 2 a.m. on your shitty speakers, and it's probably gonna fall apart on every other device people listen on. So I think there's something to be said about using your eyes and ears. There's a lot of great metering tools that can help confirm what we're hearing. There's also the ability to reference other songs and compare what you're hearing. There are mix translation checks you could do from laptop to earbuds to phone to your big speakers. All of those things help. I wouldn't just trust your ears. I mean, I don't even trust my ears. Mixing while you work was tough for me. I had to put it in the B tier though, and I think it's because it's nuanced. You want to keep things sounding great while working. I'm a big believer in you will always make decisions based on what you hear in that moment. So if what you're hearing in the moment sounds like shit, your bad decisions can compound because what you're hearing might be incorrect. So I get that we want things to sound great from jump. But at the same time, mixing while you work slows down the process significantly, and it forces a lot of producers, especially early in their journey, to get stuck in these 8-bar loops and never really get past that. They're so consumed with the technicality, they're forgetting about writing a song, arranging a song. Where I actually like the messages, I do think you should try and work and make things sound great, but limit yourself to what mixing means. Focus more on making things sound great through sound selection, sounds that complement each other, your volume levels, stereo spacing, which can be achieved through sound selection. And to make us feel better, like, we will give ourselves an opportunity to fully mix the track later on. So if you can get a song out of you that sounds decent by making basic mixing decisions, you will still have that opportunity to go nuts on it and take something that already sounds like a 7 out of 10 and make it that 10. Okay, so A tier. This is where the core idea is excellent, but there still is this risk of people taking it too literal or too serious, and it ends up causing more harm than good. Mixing in mono is definitely A tier advice, and here's why it works. Mono does a great job of exposing some of the tricks that stereo will play on us. So for example, the first big one. When we listen to our song in mono, you want to make sure it still sounds similar in the sense that your lead element should be the same in both mixes. If I listen to your song on stereo or I listen on mono, your lead better be the same lead. If it's a vocal, that vocal better be up front in both. What you want to check is when you bring it to mono, do your main elements still translate that way? Because a lot of times in a stereo mix, we're enamored by width. So you make things really wide, and then when you collapse to mono, they get much quieter. That's what we have to be aware of. Your main elements have to translate the same in terms of volume and focus, whether someone's listening in mono or listening on stereo. So it does a good job of that volume check. The other thing it's great for is exposing competition in the frequency spectrum. When you only have one channel, it's much easier to hear, let's say, 2 sounds competing at 1K than it would be if you were listening in stereo, because we could place them in different spaces. Now, where people go wrong is they probably live in one or the other too long. And I think it should just be a healthy back and forth. Produce in stereo, get your elements sounding right, but you should constantly be checking in mono. And remember, your focal points need to still show up as focal points. Cutting before you boost is A tier for me. I think this is really good advice. And it might be because I work with so many producers who come to me and have a ton of mix problems. It's a great starting point because you can solve masking issues by reducing volume and energy rather than boosting. And it gets problematic because you're probably boosting in an already crowded mix. When you boost things too, your ears also hear it as being louder, you think the decision is better. It's a slippery slope. How I like to kind of break this down is we would cut, not necessarily before we boost, it's more cut to solve mixing issues. When you have sounds that you're trying to fit together in the mix, that is the time for subtractive EQ. So does that mean we never boost? No, I don't think so. Like, I'm a fan of boosting when I want to color and shape individual sounds. That's not me thinking about the mix, it's more me thinking about the tonal balance of the sound. So there are times and places to do both, but I think the advice of cutting before you boost in a mixing perspective is really, really beneficial. And if you want, one of my last videos was on this exact topic where I go even further. So I'll pin it in the description below. You could check that out where I fully explain this process. don't solo things when you're processing is amazing advice. Now, always a caveat because there is a time and place to solo sounds and process sounds, but let's talk bigger picture first. When we are mixing, we are fitting a bunch of sounds together, and the decisions we make are not always what's best for that individual sound, but that decision has to be what's best for fitting all of these sounds together. What might work for one sound may not work when 20 others are playing at the same time. So making our mixing decisions when we're trying to fit things together in context of the mix makes a lot more sense. Now, we can still listen in solo mode when we are, shaping an individual sound like we just talked about with EQ, or you want to hear detail and envelope and shape and tail of a sound. That stuff is fine, but as soon as you get into, I need to take this sound and place it in the mix with everything else, get out of solo mode and make those decisions in context of the full mix. Your bass being in mono is A-tier advice. It's really, really good. At the same time, I'm about to give you a reason to put your bass in stereo, but let's talk first low end and your sub. So stereo low end can cause a lot of phasing issues where you would have inconsistency in your low end energy. It also just centralizes it in the mix, so having your sub in mono makes a lot of sense. Now let's talk about something like our mid bass. As we move up the spectrum, these can be stereo. They don't have to be mono. This is more about a mix decision and translation decision. If I have a wide bass, sometimes it might not come across as clear in the mix, and your bass line doesn't sound strong, where that might be an opportunity to put it down the middle, and maybe it translates different. Sometimes too, you might spread your mid bass out wide, and then when you check in mono, that cancellation again doesn't translate your bass strong enough. Well, that might be an issue, and we might need to take that mid bass in mono. So as soon as you get up out of the sub into the low mids, and things like that, you're free to put your bass out wide, but always check translation and make sure it's sounding the way you want it to sound. S tier, these are the real ones. We can make billboards of these and put them in Times Square. All right, so mixing at low volumes is incredible S-tier advice. There's a few factors at play here. So like one is the psychoacoustic effect, where when we hear things louder, we perceive them to be better. I'm sure you've done this, right? You're coming up with your idea, you crank the volume and it just seems better, feels better. But then you step out, you come back listening at a normal level and it's like, oh, what the fuck? This sounds terrible. The other big issue with mixing at louder levels is your ears will fatigue quick. Now, when we specifically say mixing and we're trying to achieve that final detail and balance, I don't want my ears fatiguing quick by any means. I want to hear things accurately. So try and find a comfortable listening level. One other thing to just keep in mind is if you're working in headphones, your ears can fatigue much quicker, especially if any of you are mixing in closed back headphones, the ones that are sealed. Your ears do tire very quick, so take your breaks. You could also look at a pair of open back headphones. They're a little bit easier and truer to mix on, but something to keep in mind. Maybe my favorite one on the list because it is so damn true. You can't polish a turd. I don't care what plugins you have. I don't care what ozone version you're using. It does not matter. Your master will still sound like shit if the production and mix sound like shit. Your mix will sound like shit if your sound selection is shit. Your sound selection won't matter if the songwriting and arrangement sucks. We can't polish turds at any stage of the production process. And I get it, people misuse this because yes, you can mix a song to make it sound better, but it doesn't fix the fundamental problem. Your core ingredients were weak. And there's a ceiling to how good you can make that sound if the core ingredients are weak. Where if you were able to fix that from a fundamental sound selection standpoint or writing standpoint, sky's the limit. Here's a quick test for this one. Bypass your entire effects chains, whether this is on a single sound or the entire mix. If the song or sound isn't compelling anymore, then you have a much bigger issue you need to go back and address. Sidechaining the bass to the kick is like have to do, must do kind of thing, right? So obviously this is going to be S tier. It allows us to achieve the loudness that we're chasing in the end. And I think this is important to understand, where you have a target, and some of the targets for some of the genres we all make are fucking crazy, right? When you're trying to hit these levels, if your low end isn't balanced correctly, let's say they're overlapping and fighting and producing more volume than they need to, it's gonna prevent you from getting the rest of the track as loud as it needs to be. Now, a couple areas where I see people kind of like skip through sidechain is they just throw kickstart on a basic preset and they think that's enough to get by. But what I would always say is you want to be a little bit more specific. You are ducking around the competing frequencies in your kick. So your lowest bass layers, like your sub, have to duck around the sub of the kick, which is usually the tail. But as you go up the frequency spectrum to your mid bass, your leads, and all those higher elements, they don't technically have to have such a deep pump around the entire kick. They're only competing with the mids and highs of the kick, which is that front transient, the front punch part of the kick. So when you sidechain, if you're sidechaining for precision, think about this. If it's a higher sound, you could be very, very quick with your sidechain duck. If you have a lower pitch sound, it tends to have to duck much deeper. Now, we could also sidechain by ear. Usually anything that's not your bass, like leads and instruments throughout the mid-range, we could do a lot of it by ear, and what we're chasing more is just rhythm and groove. So please, just moving forward, put more thought into sidechain because it is beyond the basic kickstart preset that 99% of us use. Reference tracks are mandatory. This is S tier, and this is not just the most important one, but the most beneficial one to you. Your brain adapts to whatever you've been listening to. So if you're just driving home your song for 30 minutes, your ear starts to understand that, and that becomes your baseline level of like what normal is, what good is. Reference tracks will immediately snap you out of that. They will correct all of your decisions where maybe you were starting to balance things in an incorrect way where it's starting to feel like a different genre. Maybe you realize you're missing elements when you compare your songs. They're going to be that roadmap for you that shows you how to get to your destination. Now, one thing you want to keep in mind with reference tracks, you are comparing to something that is mixed and mastered. So one of the things you first want to make sure is that your loudness levels are matched. When you reference with other songs, you want that volume change to be equal. Plugins like Metric AB can do this for you, which is incredible, but it's really important to have that so you're not judging things on, oh, this is louder, it's better. We want that level playing field so we can accurately compare the balances of the mix. Other things you could listen for: stereo, how wide things are in their song, how wide are things in yours, which elements are out wide, which elements are narrow. You could put a low cut on the reference and your track, get rid of all the low end. How does the bass translate through the mids? There are so many ways we can use reference tracks that'll help guide us. All right, so now to the final tip, and we are going out of the S tier even higher, which you didn't know exists, but it does. And that's the moose tier. There's only one tip in this moose tier, and it's because it's the kind of shit that will change your life forever. If you want to apply to Cosmic Academy, there's a pinned comment below. Ha, I gotcha.